Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Fort, and we're here for a video which will appear, of course, in the Friday Reads playlist here on the channel, where I try to attack some of the bigger ideas in literature. And this comes to us from Misa. So, Misa, thank you for being here. I am afraid that I took too long to respond because this is something that I took very, very seriously, and I wanted to actually have a thorough answer before I made the video. Now, what we're talking about today, and if you have questions that you want to see me tackle here on the Friday Reads on Strip Cover Lit about literature, etc., literature, writing, poetry, short stories, novels, whatever, leave a comment in the comment section below, and I will try to get around to your question as well. But this, again, comes to us from Misa, and the question evolved around the ethics of artificial intelligence and literature, artificial intelligence and writing, artificial intelligence in general, along with what it is that we love here on this channel, which is the literary arts, And I want to start someplace that would seem a bit of a detour from that if we're going to start anywhere at all. I want to tell you the story about four other stories. You know Frankenstein. We're currently kind of going through Frankenstein on the channel. I have a really long series that I have to get back to, but it was written by Mary Shelley. And how was it written? Well, Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, and John Polidori were on a retreat in 1816, which was known as the Year Without a Summer because it was so rainy. They were at Lake Geneva, and they got themselves into a bit of a scary story competition. Now, Frankenstein, during this scary story competition, was not the only famous book written. Polidori wrote The Vampire on this very same excursion, or at least both of these novels were written as what would become Frankenstein and the Vampire. But they were all telling stories. They all had dared each other to write the scariest story they could, and Frankenstein and the Vampire sprang up from that occurrence. What about The Lord of the Rings? The Lord of the Rings was actually written during a literary discussion group known as the Inklings. There was a literary discussion group, and, well, wouldn't you know it, a great series was birthed from those occurrences. What about The Old Man and the Sea? Well, Hemingway's previous novel, Across the River and Into the Trees, was panned. And one critic even said of Hemingway, he was a man out at twilight with nothing left to say. And this got under Hemingway's skin, and he wrote what, in my opinion, is his best novel, a very short novel, a very brief novel, a very Hemingwayan novel. He was called by a critic no longer Hemingway. That's basically what that criticism of Hemingway meant. And from that criticism, a great novel was birthed. What about On the Road, a novel that I did not like? I could not stand that novel, but basically what happened was Jack Kerouac kept notes on his road trips with friends. Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Neil Cassidy, Hunter S. Thompson. And afterwards, after he had all of his notes put together, Kerouac decided to write the novel and emulated Ernest Hemingway himself. So these are all texts. Why am I telling these stories about stories? These are all texts that were heavily influenced by other works, by other people, and by other writers. They were not manifested whole cloth out of a writer's imagination. There was prompting behind them. There was input from others. There is a story about the story itself. And we wouldn't say that these stories were stolen. We do not expect attribution from or of the other people in the Inklings literary discussion group. No, all of that credit belongs to the author. And these things are basically crowdsourced. These stories are basically crowdsourced. Not completely. They were obviously written through hard work and toil by the writer, his or herself, but they were influenced heavily from outside. That is a type of crowdsourcing. We do not, for some reason, offer artificial intelligence this same type of grace. And I think that largely what it is because of the artificial behind the intelligence. When you look at Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, there is no doubt, I think, to anyone that inside that group at that time, there were influences from others. It was still the genius of Mary Shelley that went on to write, to compose, to put together the novel that was Frankenstein. That is Mary Shelley's work. So, a writer leaning on artificial intelligence in today's world is basically turning to his corner and looking at Lord Byron, looking at Percy Shelley, looking at John Polidori, and saying, hey, what do you think about this? That is all that turning to AI is for a writer in today's world. It is basically just Google search with a little bit of extra prodding. It's Google search with an extra oomph behind it. That's what the AI is for a writer putting a work into process. Moving on to the second part here. Intro to reproduction. Not that reproduction. East of Eden by John Steinbeck is a retelling of... So the first intro to process. These are original stories. These are original stories that have crowdsourced elements to their production. But in the second section here, we're going to talk about works that are a little bit different, works that are perhaps a little bit more recycled than they were in that first section. East of Eden by John Steinbeck is essentially a retelling of Cain and Abel. Absalom heavily alludes to David and his son Absalom. Paradise Lost by John Milton is a reconceptualization of the Adam and Eve story. These things are not said to be rip-offs if you are a reader. We do not blame the authors, John Steinbeck, John Milton, etc., of works that reproduce, that retell, that rework former stories. We don't accuse them of stealing these previous stories. No one's going to John Milton and saying that he's unoriginal for Paradise Lost. Basically, all texts are basically a person processing someone else's story into something partially original and prosaically their own. These things, these stories that are more heavily reproduced than more original works like Frankenstein, Lord of the Rings, etc., these works are said to be a furtherance in their own right. So, with AI, artificial intelligence oftentimes does this same thing. All artificial intelligence is doing is downloading a story the way that we download a story and retelling it the way that we retell stories. This act has been with literature so long as literature has been around. The very process of storytelling is basically that. Before we had written language, en masse, storytellers would memorize stories, would memorize someone else's story and retell it as their own. That is the very quintessential portion of what storytelling is. The artificial in artificial intelligence does not mean that that part of storytelling has to die. It just doesn't. Now, the first turning here. This is a quote from Stephen King. If you don't have the time to read, you don't have the time or tools to write. This quote is not saying that reading makes you a unique writer. No. What this quote is saying is that to write is essentially to steal. From Stephen King, who's written more books than God, who's sold more books than God, is basically saying if you don't have the time to read what others are saying, then you don't have the time to write yourself. This is saying that all writing, all literature, all books are in some way a repurposing of other texts. AI operates the same way that we do, and ironically, this may be one of the things that is holding the machines back. What if there is some more efficient way to learn than do we? If it were AI figuring out how to learn for itself, would AI already be leaps and bounds beyond where it is that we are? But King here is not saying that the world of literature is entirely and manifestly its own. So we have to live there to plant a garden. You have to live in the literature in order to plant your garden there to watch it bloom. That is what AI is doing as well by processing different stories and regurgitating something slightly different. You have to read things because to be an author is to be, in part, a thief. That has always been a part of what it means to be an author. Now, the second turning here is something that is, I think, particularly interesting. Harold Bloom is one of the most famous literary critics of our age, probably the most famous literary critic of our age, and he wrote a book called The Anxiety of Influence. And one of the things, here's a brief summary of The Anxiety of Influence. A Theory of Poetry is a 1973, The Anxiety of Influence, A Theory of Poetry, is a 1973 book by Harold Bloom on the anxiety of influence in writing poetry. It was the first in a series of books that advanced a new revisionary or antithetical approach to literary criticism. Bloom's central thesis is that poets are hindered in their creative process by the ambiguous relationship they necessarily maintain with precursor poets. While admitting the influence of extra literary experience on every poet, he argues that the poet in a poet is inspired to write by reading another poet's poetry and will tend to produce work that is in danger of being derivative of existing poetry, and therefore weak. Because poets historically emphasize an original poetic version in order to guarantee their survival into posterity, this is something we're going to talk about later. The influence of precursor poets inspires a sense of anxiety in living poets. Thus, Bloom attempts to work out the process by which a small minority of strong poets manage to create original work in spite of pressure of influence. Such an agon, a vain attempt by a writer to resolve the conflict between his ideas and those of a much more influential predecessor, Bloom argues depends on 6 revisionary ratios, which reflect Freudian and quasi-Freudian defense mechanisms, as well as the tropes of classical rhetoric. Basically, what Bloom is arguing here is that not only is theft a great way to build a toolbox, it may be inescapable. All poets, all writers, I would think this would extend to, are sort of anxious, are afraid of the fact that probably all they're doing is repackaging someone else's thoughts, repackaging someone else's works, and passing it on as their own. That is from Harold Bloom, who is one of the most influential critics, literary critics, probably of all time, but certainly of our time. The final turning here, but part of the argument here is not about writers using AI. It's not about writers using AI as a tool and unwittingly nabbing parts of other stories, as all writers do, but the wholesale passing on of AI synthesized works to paying customers or to a professor for a passing grade. That is part of the anxiety here, part of the question of ethics behind artificial intelligence and literature. As for the professors, I have no sympathy. Students have always copied, cheated, and stolen, and rarely has anyone ever actually cared. But the real price for the student in the after effects of using AI to create their own paper is that student then did not go through that process. That student will pay in the free marketplace of ideas when he or she is without the tools to create ideas, to manufacture ideas. And so, yeah, maybe he gets the A. Who cares? But after he has that degree, he's kind of up a creek. But what about a consumer? What about AI ripping off, or maybe ripping off is probably not the right term, but AI scribbling out an entirely new novel and someone selling that as a novel? Is there ethics to that? And in order to answer that, I have to turn to something that I love. I love Emily Dickinson. But if Emily Dickinson walked through my apartment door right now, you would never see me again. But if she did, she would be absolutely livid at me and excoriate me for all of the harebrained readings that I have done of her work. She would hate me for all the stuff I've said about her poetry and all the ways that I have misread her poetry, and I would not care. Why? Well, those poems belong to me now. Those poems are no longer hers, they are mine. The real work is with the reader. So if someone is passing off AI literature as real literature, whatever that means, who is losing? Well, the writer builds the house. The reader furnishes it. The writer builds the house, the reader furnishes it. The real work of literature is not with the writer, but the reader. That is where I stand with whether or not it is ripping someone off to compose an entire novel with AI and sell it as original. All writers have stolen bits and pieces from here and there. That artificial intelligence rather than real intelligence is doing it is no different to me. But what about those pesky, starving artists and writers? Shouldn't they be compensated if AI has had a cursory glance over their work and simply regurgitates it as opposed to reconfiguring it the way that another writer would reconfigure their work? Well, the same copyright laws are going to apply to AI as apply to anything else. So if you have a work out there and AI copies it and spits it out and someone else sells it, you get to sue Google. You get to sue Microsoft. You get to sue Meta. And trust me, they're going to pay out much more and much faster than some other artist that you are suing. And the question of permission for AI to crawl a work, right? So I have written a work. I have made all of these videos online. And AI does not ask my permission to look over them. Well, actually, Google has made me decide whether or not I will let AI crawl over my videos. But Hemingway never gave Kerouac the nod. Kerouac loved Hemingway and decided to emulate his style for his own. How is AI any different? And this is where we get to the final point here, the imminently immortal. What is the purpose of literature? What is the purpose of writing? What is the purpose of telling these stories? As a final point, I would like to raise a point about the soul of the craft. And as I believe the creative, artistic act is the most human of acts, I think that creating is the most human thing we do. Art is the most human thing we do, the most quintessentially human thing we do. No one else does that. No other animals make art. This is the very soul of our species. And now we have competition. On a human level, on an animal level, we eat to survive, but we love to live forever. The act of procreation, of making children, is the closest we will get to immortality. That is sort of widely considered, if not the meaning of life, at least part of the meaning of life. Procreation. Every part of the animal kingdom does that. So that's the animal portion of us, not the human portion of us. The human portion of us, the soul of the human portion of us is art. If procreation is to live forever, if making your children is to live forever, that's the animal part of you living forever. How does the human part of you live forever? The Library of Alexandria is something that I think about quite a bit. What stories and how many stories and how many ideas and how many different branches of technology and how many different branches of philosophy and how many different branches of literature were lost when the Library of Alexandria burnt down? Lost forever. Gone. The idea of living forever is in our species because of religion. Like Mary being assumed to the clouds. Assumption into the cloud and AI may facilitate a writer's ideas to live forever. If you write to live forever and there is some quirk in your writing that AI picks up on, is that living forever? How many stories and ideas, therefore, writers will continue to influence because of the influence of artificial intelligence? In my opinion, the artificial part of this is the sticking point for many people. And I don't really understand it. I don't really get why the artificial portion of the artificial intelligence is a sticking point. And here's why. I've never really had people. So, in that first case, the writing of Frankenstein, I've never really had people to bounce ideas off of like that. AI could be that for me. It could allow me the year without a summer. And while we're at it, how many writers have you known that were particularly social and or even moderately sociable? How many writers cannot afford to go to college, but they can afford $20 a month for an OpenAI subscription through which they can bounce their ideas off of an AI? What is the big to do about ethics and AI? Is it the mass market stripping of literature for ideas in order to be reproduced and spit out, regurgitated to other writers, to other readers? Guys, that's all we do anyway. Where is the big to do there? That's all literature is. That's all it's ever been. That's all it is likely to ever be. Maybe someone comes along that is so original in their storytelling that it changes the way that we understand what stories are in general. They've had a long time to come along. They haven't yet. We recreate stories before us and we pass them on with small tweaks, small things changed in our own likeness. And that is what literature is. One of the things that has been so interesting to me in artificial intelligence and quote unquote art, because I don't think that it produces art, at least not yet. But art is just like beauty in the eye of the beholder, right? If there is something there to be interpreted, it's up to the interpreter, not the artist itself. One of the things that has been interesting to me is in the visual art department of this. Part of that is I can go into OpenAI, into DALL-E, which is the OpenAI visual art producer, and say, give me a picture of Winnie the Pooh as a, well, I probably can't use Winnie the Pooh because that is a copyrighted thing, but give me a picture of a ghost in the Taj Mahal in the style of Caravaggio. And AI can do that. It can make a Caravaggio-esque painting of a ghost in the Taj Mahal. It could not have made that picture if Caravaggio never existed. In the style of Caravaggio would have meant nothing had Caravaggio never lived. I could say, give me a painting in the style of Leonardo that depicts two lions standing on top of a Jeep. And it could do that. Why? Who knows? But it could. Because Leonardo existed. Likewise, I can go in there and say, give me 300 words on well, maybe I can't do that, but on a football game of firefighters versus police officers in the style of Ernest Hemingway. And it will produce something generally in that direction. But it could not have done so without Hemingway existing. In the style of Hemingway would have meant absolutely nothing. So the to-do, in my opinion, about AI ripping off artists is really nothing more, nothing different, nothing less than what you can do at the corner the corner painter saying, make me a picture in the style of Caravaggio. And he's down there painting portraits, and maybe he can make one in the style of Caravaggio, maybe he can't. But AI will likely always be able to do so. I don't understand the real hang-up on ethics around this. All we have ever done with art is copy. All we will ever do with art is copy and make small tweaks and changes along the way. Art is engineered in the same way that is, for example, a car. One of the reasons that, for example, Tesla has come along and been so successful, despite the fact that they are starting with much higher costs than an engine-run ICE car, is because they've been so innovative around the edges. They have changed so many things that were for so long accepted to be just part of the process by the big car industry. There are things in the big art industry that are going to be exposed by AI and are going to be taken out of the process. I think that AI is going to clean up a lot of art. It may muddy some of the playing field, but the stands will be nicer to sit in. I do not see the big to-do about ethics and AI. That is all I have for this video. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every single week. And as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.